Hello everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Measuring the Real Value of an Engineering Content Management Solution. Our presenter today is James Cookson of Blucello. James is a specialist in value-driven approaches to engineering content management. He has conducted numerous value assessments with large companies in capital-intensive industries located across the Benelux, United Kingdom, and United States to produce business cases with in-depth cost-benefit and ROI analyses. Many of these companies have subsequently moved forward, leveraging the business cases to justify additional investments. In today's webinar, James will examine how value assessments can be used to quantify the real benefits of an ECM solution, uncover the truth on how they should be done, and explain Blucello's unique value assessment process. But before we begin, a bit of housekeeping. I want to let everyone know that you're in listen-only mode. Please make note of any questions you may have as we go along, and at the end of the presentation, we will invite you to type your questions, which I will then read to James for him to answer. Additionally, all those attending today will receive a thank you email from us with a link to view the recorded version of this webinar. So with that, James, you can go ahead and begin whenever you're ready.
Well, thank you very much, Susan, and thank you all for attending today. I hope you find the webinar informative, of course. So indeed, measuring the real value of an engineering content management solution, and in doing so, quantifying the benefits and true financial impact. So to illustrate this and to begin with, I'd like to start with 3 scenarios. And so each scenario, I hope at least you'll find some commonality with them. And I selected these as kind of 3 prominent use cases. So the first here being a retrospective scenario. So you've had the solution in place and you've seen the value in it, and you're considering moving this to other sites. But first you need to justify it. So that's scenario 1. Scenario 2, also retrospective. We've had the solution in place also, but now we're looking for closure, and we want to see if we achieve the goals that we set out to at the beginning. The third scenario is slightly different. It's a prospective scenario, and as such will be answered a bit later on in the webinar. So in this case, you don't have a solution in place just yet, but first you want to make sure that it's going to be worth your investment in the long run. So moving forwards, how do companies typically justify these investments, and with what methods do they use? So can we justify these additional investments with just anecdotal information? Can we use stories? Is a qualitative understanding sufficient? Can we tell whether or not we've achieved our goals based on a guess? And is it enough to hear the promise from the vendor to convince your upper management to invest in these solutions? So typically, for many customers, the answer is no. So of course, the answer lies in measurement, as is the topic of this webinar. And in the literature, measurement goes by a few different names in this area. So you see post-implementation review, post-implementation assessments, and also post-implementation audits. So just to get the naming, at Blucello we refer to this as a value assessment. So with these value assessments, there of course is a lot to gain. So of course you can gain a lot of insights, so you can understand where value is created and how much value. It's important to be able to assess the contribution of the solution to your business objectives specifically. Of course, once your solution is in place, it's important to improve. You can't stand still in these days, and it's important to identify that there's no value being left on the table. And of course, you want to actualize these gains and these benefits, and you want to take full advantage of the system's value. So among those 4, there are many, many other benefits, of course, and here's just a few of them highlighted in this word cloud here. So despite all of these benefits, Gartner estimates that only 20% of companies actually conduct them, which is quite startling when you imagine the gains that you are missing out on. Typically, they're avoided for a variety of reasons, but mainly because they take up a lot of time, or they use up scarce personnel resources in the organization that they can't devote to such an initiative. Also, the project sponsors and the implementers themselves often fear the results, because what if it backfires? Perhaps they're scared of that. Maybe it'll elicit some negative results, and they could be held accountable. So naturally, they fear that possibility, and thus they have this finish it and bury it mentality. But I think that Jim Smith said it best here. So, with the pressure on business today and the responsibility of IT to help the business units understand where their dollars are being spent, I really have trouble with anyone saying you shouldn't be doing PIAs or post-implementation assessments in this hard economic time. So Jim Smith is the CIO of Sun Life Financial. So with the literature and this being picked up as a best practice, it's clear that it's an important step to be taken, especially for highly effective organizations. And this is why. So contrary to the famous saying, ignorance is not always bliss. So failures are better known and dealt with than buried, of course. And it's important to kind of get this mentality that IT implementations are not necessarily just IT projects, but they should be seen as business projects, and they should be given the same care as such. So, and of course, it's best to be proactive in the event that these failures arise, and figure out what can be done to improve them. So also, without measurement, it's impossible to draw any alignment with your business strategy. So hopefully by now you have this feeling that perhaps you want to conduct a value assessment, but how? Well, unfortunately, first there are a few layers of complexity that stand in your way. So what industry are you in? There are differences between them, of course, in valuing the solutions. What size is the site that you want to assess? Are there multiple sites, perhaps of varying sizes, of course? Do you have various asset or software integration? And do you have multiple departments accessing the technical documentation? Are there multiple different types of workers who need to gain access and thus have different uses for them? And do you have multiple document workflows and life cycles? Although hopefully they don't look quite like this. So with these layers of complexity, it's important to know that Blucello is geared to solve these kinds of problems. So value assessments has been a really important initiative in Blucello over the past years, and it's been gaining a lot of effort, and we put a lot of time into this. And along the way, we've utilized this combination of academic knowledge, these technical competences, and 20 years of being at the forefront of our industry. What's important to note is that to date, the value assessment initiative within Blucello has been developed completely in isolation of other Blucello departments. And this is done so to remain detached, of course, to prioritize accuracy and precision and make sure it's independently steered. Yeah. So to deal with this complexity, we take a scientific approach. Now, by a scientific approach, we mean that we use a very structured, systematic approach, and it ensures that whenever we do one of these value assessments, we're confident in that we will uncover the value, and accurately so. So there are key characteristics of the scientific approach. So first is to have a hypothesis, and then analysis, and then synthesis. So to describe what we mean by those, so first we come in with a hypothesis to explain the likely structure of the how we're going to analyze, and it's a basis, our starting point for the analysis. By analysis, of course, we break things down, and that's a common theme you'll see over the next few slides. We really break things down into their components, evaluate each one, and then in turn we synthesize them back into a connected whole. So the result of this approach is to have frameworks. So the use of frameworks. So we have developed these Blucello frameworks to cover all potential areas of value creation, of course, and it really deals well with this complexity that we're confronted with. Importantly, the frameworks were designed to be mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive, or MICE as McKinsey consultants would refer to it. So this basically means that we don't double count, and of course we don't miss any areas. So what comprises these frameworks? There are three main areas that we have developed frameworks for that contribute to overall value creation, as shown here. The first being worker productivity, the second being a higher up at the asset level, and the third being checks, so safety, health, environmental, and quality, and also knowledge benefits. So I'd like to just give you a taste of how these frameworks have been developed and the kind of thinking behind each one. So starting with worker productivity. So here you might see some familiar topics. So this is what we consider kind of the life cycle of a document. There are some major topics here. So modifying the document, collaborating, handover at the end, and also complying to regulatory authorities, of course. So within these areas, we break them down. So if we take document modification as an example, we would break it down into some major activities that employees would be conducting. So when modifying a document, you might search for the master, you might be commenting or discussing or redlining on these documents, you might have to create renditions, for example, or you might have to compile many documents for an engineering change request. So we would in turn evaluate these elements. Similarly, at the asset level, we also have an asset life cycle. So these are major topics such as procurement or commissioning an asset, operating, maintaining, for example, and even decommissioning at the end. So once again, we can take an example here. So let's take maintenance. And we see what the major elements of maintenance are that we consider, at least. So we have topics like root cause analysis, dealing with unplanned downtimes or even planned downtimes, managing your spare parts, and so on. But this is still at quite a high level, so we'd break down it further. And these are the kinds of data points that we look to collect in order to see what is the impact on unplanned downtimes here. So we look at for the annual number of unplanned downtimes, the average unplanned downtime duration, of course, and any costs involved to the asset during those downtimes. For check and knowledge benefits, it's broken down slightly differently. So we have identified four main stakeholders of this area. They are the employee, the customer, the community and environment, and of course shareholders. And again, we break them down. So to take employee as an example, we look at safety aspects, incidents and accidents, the accessibility of knowledge, or even tacit knowledge retention, which is an interesting topic. Typically, the areas of benefit that are discussed in this section are more of an intangible nature, but still comprise a very important area of benefit, and of course always we collect as much data as we can here as well, although usually it's qualitative. So with these frameworks, can one size fit all? So not exactly. We use these frameworks to be our hypothesis, and we use them in a hypothesis-driven way. So when we look into the framework and we collect data in a specific area, if it does not apply to the customer in question, we simply move on to the next element. So at the end, the framework molds itself to the situation. So and here the point that the utilization of the framework is very different across customers. And to illustrate this point further, I've included this graph here. So this graph is a comparison across 4 companies, but specifically looking at a CAD person, so a CAD draftsman or a CAD designer. And here are some frequently completed tasks by the CAD person. You can see that only in searching, which is the second from the bottom activity, do we see all 4 companies present in using that function. So you can see that across the rest of the areas, it's really diverse in terms of which CAD person actually does them, or how much time they have saved in that area. So this is the unit here is hours per week. So as you can see, it is very different how the framework ends up being used. But with the framework, we've also had to find a middle ground in the granularity. So you can see that we're breaking things down, but of course you can break things down almost indefinitely. But we have to find this middle ground. So if you're too granular, the framework becomes unworkable. And actually, there would be very little additional benefit because in terms of evaluating the solution, it would probably have very little impact to the overall numbers. But if you're not granular enough, of course, you end up with imprecise results. So, of course, a main attribute of this framework is that it is a repeatable process and it enforces the systematic approach. So I'd like to give you a taste here for what data collection might look like. So if we take that example again, document modification, and we see the topics that are underneath it. So if we take search for master documents as an example, what are the dimensions of the data collection? So first we have to gauge the involvement. So what employees are involved here? Who does this? And how many of them, of course. So, and what is the cost for each employee type? And we always take the fully loaded hourly cost to be the representative of the best results. The next thing we have to gauge is the frequency with which these tasks are done, and also the duration with of each of how long it takes to complete the task. Fourthly, we need to gauge the evolution over time. So, of course, when you implement a solution, it's often the case that the performance of the solution in the first year, or at least the end results in the first year, are different than the second or third year. So typically there might be some bugs that are ironed out, or people become more familiar with the system, and so therefore we'd expect there to be an increase in the benefits over time. Last thing is called a correction factor. So this may be a new topic for some of you. So it's basically a multiple which we always attach to worker productivity benefit calculations, and this is to account for the inefficient transfer of time. What this means is it's the concept that because you save someone an hour of time, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to use that full hour for 100% productivity in that saved hour. So this is a multiple we attach, and they're different across different FTE types. So to illustrate this further, I've included here an example calculation. So we're going to take that search for master documents example and see how a CAD draftsman has made savings with it. So here we have some data. It's simple numbers. So if we look at the first row, search time, So in year zero, we call year zero is used to represent the situation representative of just before implementation. So basically implement the go live date minus 1 day. So basically pre-implementation. So here it says that on average, a single CAD draftsman would spend 2 hours per week searching for master documents. In year one, you can see an improvement that's actually cut down by half. And then year two, it's down to 3/4 of an hour, and so on. And these kinds of improvements are actually very typical, and they can even be more significant than this. So in the second row is a calculation of how much has been saved. So obviously going from 2 hours down to 1 hour from year 0 to year 1 results in a 1 hour saving. And then year 2 at 1.25 hour saving, and year 3 at 1.4 hour saving. So on top of this data, we also need some others. So the fully loaded hourly cost of this CAD draftsman here is $90. And this person also works 47 weeks of the year. And the correction factor that we typically use for a CAD draftsman is around 0.6. So with that in mind, the year one savings would be that hour saved per year multiplied by the number of weeks worked in the year, 47, multiplied by the cost per hour and the correction factor. This results in a saving of just over $2,500 per year. Now this is the saving of one CAD draftsman just for this feature or this activity of searching for master documents. And you can also see the year 2 and year 3 savings are increased, corresponding with the increased time saving. So might not seem like much at the moment, but this really can mount up. Another method to maybe even more precisely gauge the frequency at which these events occur is to use this method. So here we have 4 commonly seen employee types, and they are involved in a workflow. So here is a workflow from the document, from creation to the release to master stage. It's a simple workflow that involves the CAD draftsman initiating the process, modifying a document, and then going through some approval stages by a project engineer and a project manager. And then you can see how it feeds back when they say when there's a no on they don't approve, of course. But when both have approved, then it is passed down to the document controller, who releases it and notifies and stores. So when we've identified a workflow like this, we can then start to think, well, what activities or tasks is the solution, the system supporting us throughout this workflow? And here is, we overlay those in orange. So you can see, in an approval stage, you might have to do many things, such as search for different versions. You might have to compare the different versions side by side. You have to review it, you have to approve it, and well, naturally you also have to, sometimes you have to open the documents in their native applications. These are all areas in orange that an ECM solution could help. So now we see what activities are done where, and then we can go into further detail by stating that there are 150 new documents for every project. And perhaps each drawing goes through the cycle on average 5 times. And you can see how we're mounting up the numbers here, and of course we need to know how many projects are conducted per year. And then we multiply it by these numbers of tasks, the number of people involved, and the cost of the people, and you can get to a very precise saving using this method. So I'd like to now share with you some exemplary results. So here is an implementation that has been done over 7 years. So the go live date was in 2007. And these are the numbers that we see coming out the other end. So a net present value of this whole 7-year implementation of $2.5 million. And then we also have the overall return on investment of 393%. We have the IRR, and we also have a payback period. So these financial parameters are often used by financial departments or CFOs to really judge the success of a project, or indeed to prospectively see if an investment is worth it. And these numbers may seem high, but are very typical of the scope of the benefits of these solutions can provide. So, and here is a cost-benefit analysis, or a breakdown of the costs and benefits over the 7-year period. You can see how, in this case, the go-live date was later in 2007, so I think it was in November. And so in 2007, it's really only recorded costs. But you can see how this quickly turns around over the subsequent years, and also how the cost decreases. So typically in the first year, you have a much higher cost because you've paid for the license fees and also the professional services fees for the implementation. And then after that, you might have some maintenance fees, but also internal costs. It's important to note here that we also take into consideration all costs that are sustained internally in the customer. So whether they have internal support costs or maintenance of hardware like their servers, or internal other license purchases, we take into consideration all of those costs here. Here is a breakdown of worker productivity gains, 2 pie charts. So on the left, you see the savings per individual user, and you see these 4 main FTE types here, full-time equivalents of document controller, the CAD draftsman, project manager, and project engineer. And you can see on the left that clearly the document controller is sustaining the largest value, and this is quite usual. But on the right, we see by role type, so almost at the departmental level. So this is taking into consideration all of the headcount involved. So as there are typically less document controllers, it's a much smaller segment on this side. Here I give a taste for another element of the value assessment, which is a sensitivity analysis. So you may have wondered earlier when I mentioned the correction factors, how are these numbers, how do you come up with these numbers, and how are they allocated? Well, correction factors are taken from industry research, but also we have been compiling our own database as we go along. But indeed, it seems like an arbitrarily added number, so it's important to do a sensitivity analysis on the impact of it. So here we see various scenarios. So we always have a conservative, a pragmatic, and optimistic scenario. And if we look at the second table first, you can see the correction factors used for each employee type. So in the pragmatic scenario for a document controller, we used 0.7, but in the conservative, 0.6. And you can see the impact of these different correction factors on the financial parameters that we were first stating. So the curve here is a cumulative net benefit curve. So net benefit being all of the benefits subtract all of the costs in each year, but cumulative over all the years. And you can see it by the end, it actually makes the difference of well, about $1 million, almost $2 million. But you can see at least a representative of the range of value. So noting all of these results and charts, these analyses and these calculations have been made into a value assessment service at Blucello. So the reason that we saw a need for this is that it alleviates those 2 common reasons why they're not done. So the fact that it takes up a lot of time from our customers and takes up their personnel resources. So with Blucello forming these calculations, it actually only takes around a day of your time or less. So we try to conduct a value assessment in a day, and talk to a number of people whilst we're there. So, and this value assessment service forms the answer to those initially stated scenarios 1 and 2. So as a reminder, here they are. So justifying further implementation and evaluating a project. So the deliverable of this value assessment is a business case which serves as a tool for high-level decision making. It of course includes an in-depth indication of where you are gaining gaining all of the value. It quantifies the benefits, not only talks about them qualitatively but in hard financial figures, and it also includes a recommendation for future growth. In addition, internally it allows you to spread the knowledge gained, a recording of all the lessons learned. It gives you also qualitative understanding of any issues that were overcome so that you can apply these learnings to any other implementations that you conduct in the future. So occasionally we see that worker productivity gains are labeled or categorized as maybe a soft benefit, and so I'd like to share some observations that I've made in some of the value assessments. So to substantiate the claims of those gains, we can see that a lot of customers are able to then conduct the same amount of work with less people, so that supports it. Also, we can see when a company has undergone significant growth, as was the case with one of our customers, that they managed to sustain that growth but not increase the number of people to support the additional work. So also we've seen literally doubling of productivity among employees, and to support this there was even cases where due to poor system performance employees would even get up and leave their desks just simply because they couldn't work with it faster. So these would all suggest that the worker productivity benefits are valid. Another area that is seen quite a lot in the literature is the principle of employee engagement. And I think this is quite a current topic. So there are many areas that contribute to employee engagement, but I've seen that there are 5 areas which these systems can definitely contribute towards. So of course productivity, as we've mentioned, the safety of the employees, the quality of the work and the data, even job satisfaction, and also customer ratings. So as in the customers of our clients. So with all this in mind, and taking into consideration that we also overlay these correction factors, the resulting figures are actually likely to be conservative. And some further figures from the industry research here. So companies with low engagement can earn an operating income of 32.7% lower than companies with more engaged employees. You can see growth of profits as much as 3 times faster in engaged companies with engaged employees. So attrition, 87% less likely to leave, and even with earnings of the company, earnings per share, 147% higher. These figures come from research done specifically employee engagement, but it just to me highlights how these systems can truly the worker productivity gains can truly be substantiated. And it's important to remember that this is actually a self-reinforcing mechanism. So if an employee is more productive and more satisfied, then they will in turn be happy with the job and also be able to influence others. another study here is on employee effectiveness. It demonstrates the importance of information integrity. So you can see a note here that the scale of the x-axis of this graph is much different, and you can see that when information integrity drops a small amount, it has a very large gearing on employee effectiveness. So here we have information integrity is defined as the degree to which documentation is accurate, up-to-date, and accessible. So noting all this, why is Blucello in this space? So we have a lot to learn from this. I mean, we've already been gaining much more enriched understanding of where and how our customers are experiencing value. And this knowledge has allowed us to further fine-tune the value assessment, of course, and tailor the content of the business case to their needs, and even has some input into our product offering for the future versions of our software. So also, of course, a very big motivation for us is to provide an accurate answer to scenario 3. So if we remember back what scenario 3 was, it was looking at the user group that have not yet implemented but are considering investing and want to be able to see what their likely return will be. So it's important to note that in this case, it's not a measurement but a forecast. It is a prospective scenario. And of course, in order to accurately forecast, there must be some base performance from which we can extrapolate. And this is the need for a database. So this database and its creation we've only been able to do this through the value assessments that we've done so far. And so the data that we're getting from other value assessments allows us to compile and average data from customers of the same industry, which we can then apply to prospective customers. But this also allows our forecasts to be far more accurate than otherwise. We can further increase precision by scaling results based on particular parameters such as the company size of the prospect, any workforce data we can get from them, and also what software or supporting modules they mean to implement. So one element that might be a concern for some viewers is that how can Blucello be conducting these without falling into questions of bias? So we worked very hard to avoid this. We want our numbers to be as precise and free of bias as possible, of course. And so we make sure that every single number used to calculate these figures are directly received from the customer, and the resulting figures are always corroborated by them. So, of course, as we mentioned before with the frameworks, it is a very rigorous process, very systematic. And in doing so, we take the scientific approach, which ensures that we don't have any leading questions, for example. And it's important to know that we also take into areas which may have been adversely affected. In some cases, we've seen where, due to the system, some employee types may have increased their workload to conduct the same task as before, but which in turn alleviates others to be more productive. And of course, we take that into consideration in the calculation. We also take a step-by-step approach, and we detach the sections. So we first identify what areas have been impacted, not stating in which direction first, and then we find how they have and try to quantify it that way. And of course, the important note that the value assessment was developed in isolation of other departments. So I think that's my final slide, and I'm going to hand it now back over to Susan, who will open it up for questions.
Thanks so much, James, for your presentation. So again, if anyone has any questions at this time, please enter them into the question panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and I will read them to James for him to answer. So let me look through them here. We have one, what people need to be involved in the assessment?
Okay. So this actually is quite dependent on the organization of the customer, so, and also who has the knowledge about the system. So the main aim here is to take a cross-section of the workforce that is impacted by the solution. So we look at all of the impacted parties, and in this way we can collect data from those who are really familiar with the average life of a person of that FT type. And since we're there we're there for a whole day usually, but not everyone has to be present for the full day. It's important to note. It can be scheduled quite flexibly, and so we could speak for an hour or two, for example, to a project engineer, and then later move on to a manager. But to answer the question, it's really dependent on who is impacted, whose lives are being changed by the system, and we try to get as much data to cover all of those areas as possible.
Okay, great. Next question. How do you conduct assessments at multiple sites?
All right, so this is a good question. So I think it begins by taking an overview of how you work per site. So sometimes customers have very standardized processes across different sites, and in such a case where it's very standardized, we could take an assessment of one site and then make extrapolations across the other sites, and this would be reasonably accurate. But however, in the case that each site is very different, maybe different sizes, or maybe one site has a different legacy system, then we would have to go deeper in order to retain that level of accuracy. But this would be quite interesting because you could then hypothetically compare the effectiveness of the same FT types across different sites, and you can see how the system and the work process are affecting there.
Okay. How do you measure the ROI of maintaining regulatory compliance?
Okay. So regulatory compliance is actually it's inherently quite difficult to measure in terms of the ROI, because there's just quite an extreme range of potential scenarios. So to illustrate that, the main impact of staying compliant is, of course, to retain the license to operate. And so the difference between retaining the license and not is, of course, really large. But currently, I mean, at least in the developed countries, most companies manage to retain the license to operate, of course, but not always in the most efficient manner. So I guess the way to evaluate that is to look into the work process involved with preparing for inspections, for example. So if you have a certain amount, you can calculate how many inspections are done per year, or if it's different regulatory authorities, and you can see what the demands are for each kind of inspection, and then you can see how efficiently those demands have been met in the past compared to now. And you can compare, yeah, obviously before they had the solution with. So that would allow at least the worker productivity side to be evaluated.
Okay, great. Next question, can an assessment be used to determine which vendor to choose?
So, yeah, I mean, this is really one of our priorities. So it's actually quite interlinked with that third scenario of not having a solution in place. So we really want to put all of the facts and figures in the hands of prospective customers, just so that they can really make that best informed decision, on which vendor to choose. It's a very complex software typically, so anything that helps them with the decision is, of course, a really high priority for us. So yes, the yes, we would support that decision with these kinds of efforts.
Okay. Someone asks, what is the most surprising finding you found so far?
Surprising. So one that comes to mind right now is that there was a customer recently where they achieved a payback period of literally only 3 to 4 months. So I think we were all very surprised at that, and we're immediately questioning the whether this was the case. But upon rechecking the data and even taking the most conservative scenarios, it was really the case. So that was very surprising. To speak in more general terms, I think one thing that I sometimes get across is just there's quite an amazing jump that has been made. So obviously, often when talking to the contact people at the customers, when they look back, they sometimes even question how they managed to work the way they used to. And so there are some crazy stories sometimes where people have to search an entire plant to find an engineer who will then approve the document. So they literally had to use like a hand delivery method, and just really inefficient method to get an approval. So these kinds of stories sometimes occur, and it's quite surprising.
Great. And let's take one more question here.
Okay.
What are the main differences between industries that you found with your value assessments?
Right. So, yeah, I think there's obviously quite a few differences. Definitely one is the kind of the types of workers that we come into contact with. So sometimes you get very specific or specialized people. So like in the marine industry, you might have a job title like a fleet manager with a completely different responsibilities, of course. And then perhaps in other industries you might get like surveyors. So definitely the kinds of workers is one way that they differ. Another would be definitely the nature of the assets. So of course in some you have very large fixed assets such as factories or plants, but again with an example of the marine companies, their assets are literally the ships, so they obviously move around the world, and so they have to keep track of the modifications on ships that are moving. That's very different. Or with telecoms, their assets are typically a lot smaller, but they have many, many of them. So they could have 6,000, for example, antennas around the country. Another difference could be within, of course, how that company works, or their work processes or their workflows. That often impacts how the value is gained. And then, yeah, another area is definitely quite conspicuous is with the importance of regulatory compliance. So of course it's important, but in some industries it's really, really vital. So for example, in a chemical plant where you have very dangerous or high pressure, high temperature equipment, and of course regulatory authorities are way more stringent than maybe, for example, in other industries where the environments are less dangerous, for example, telecommunications. I think yeah, those might be the main ones.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone in attendance today for your questions, and thank you, James, for your detailed answers. If we didn't get to your specific question, we'll make sure to have somebody follow up with you individually to do so. Otherwise, if you have any additional questions, you can reach out to us using the Contact Blucello page on our website. If you're interested in a value assessment, please email James directly using the address you see there on the screen. And if you'd like to attend our next upcoming webinar, which is with Konica, a chemical company, on Thursday, December 4th, or any of our other future events, please visit the events page on our website. And as a final reminder, all those attending today will receive a thank you email from us with the link to view the recorded version of this webinar. So with that, thank you all for attending today's webinar and have a great day.